Chad's former president, Hissene Habre, has died aged 79 after testing positive for COVID-19. He was serving a life sentence in Senegal for war crimes, crimes against humanity and torture. Under his rule, Habre enforced a brutal crackdown on dissent, where tens of thousands of people were killed.
Africa's Pinochet, Hissene Habre earned his nickname as he ruled Chad with an iron fist for 8 years in the 1980s. Cunning and charismatic, Chad's former dictator seized power in a CIA-backed coup in 1982. His paranoid and brutal regime was supported by France and the United States and based on ruthless repression. His secret police killed as many as 40,000 Chadians and kidnapped, tortured, or raped 200,000 more. Habre was overthrown by rebels in 1990 and fled to Senegal. There, he lived freely and comfortably for 22 years in an upmarket suburb of Dakar. All this time, Habre's victims were working to see him pay for his crimes. And finally, on a Sunday morning in 2013, Habre was arrested. In court, the ex-despot resisted, denying any knowledge of his crimes. But in 2016, Habre was condemned in what has been called Africa's trial of the century. It was the first time an African Union-backed court convicted a former head of state for crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Behind bars, Habre remained silent until the end. Those who suffered heard not a single word of contrition and received not a single cent in compensation. And so for his victims, the fight for justice continues.
Well, many of the victims who suffered from Habre's crimes say they want justice and compensation. DW's Fred Muvuni joins us from Lagos. Fred, you were in Chad in June. Can you tell us more about the stories of the people you met?
I had difficult stories, sad stories. I spoke to the victims who were, some of them who are women who were sexually abused under Hissene Habre's rule. I also spoke to a man who was tortured in prison, and he was forced to dig graves for his fellow cellmates in 1980s when Hissene Habre was in power. Take a look. Former prisoners drew the torture they suffered under Hissene Habre's rule. Krema Baifuta was arrested in 1985 and jailed for criticizing the government.
Pendant ces 4 ans, j'ai vécu
4 years in prison.
parmi les
I lived with dead bodies.
morts,
I was sick for 6 months
parmi
without
dans la
any
maladie.
treatment.
parce que j'ai été
But
malade
the worst
pendant 6
thing
mois.
was when I and my colleagues
Mais le
were
pire,
taken to bury the dead prisoners.
c'est que dans la journée, mes collègues et moi allons enterrer.
It's a bit of a drive. He takes me to the outskirts of the capital N'Djamena, to the mass graves where he buried his fellow prisoners.
Avec la pick-up,
We
là, on
parked
garait.
there
Et puis c'est ici
and we dug here
qu'on a
and
enterré
buried
les
37 bodies.
37 corps.
37 bodies in just one day. Just after Krema was released, there was a coup. The new boss was Idriss Deby. When Habre was removed, Krema campaigned for compensation for those who had suffered. But he says President Idriss Deby was a dictator no better than Habre. For longer than 30 years, Krema has been waiting for things to change. He had hoped Habre's conviction of crimes against humanity would help his fight for compensation.
Oui, nous avons applaudi au niveau
We
africain.
celebrated
au
in
niveau
Africa
mondial,
and the
que
whole
Hissene Habre,
world
un dictateur,
when the
vient d'être
dictator Hissene
condamné.
Habre
Mais
was
après, qu'est-ce qu'on a
convicted. But what
Juste
happened
aujourd'hui,
next? Until today, the Chadian government or the African Union who are responsible to pay reparations have done nothing. He is not sure the current leader, Déby's son Mahamat, will be much better. Idriss Déby did nothing for the victims. I pray that his son Mahamat Déby corrects the mistakes his father made. He has to start with paying reparations to the victims. Mahamat Déby has promised elections in 18-month time. That's when Clément Baifuta will find out if things will really change.
And Fred, what's been the reaction to Habre's death?
As you have heard in this story, these people have not yet received a single coin since Habre was convicted 5 years ago. And they are still waiting for the compensation. But they have another problem. Some of the Habre's henchmen are still roaming around in Chad. They are in position of power. They are just there. They are their neighbors, and they haven't even faced justice, you know. And these people, these victims, they live in fear. So that's one of so many problems they have. Then after the death of Habre, I spoke to Clément Baifuta. He told me that, you know, the death of Habre doesn't mean anything. What matters for them is that they get justice. They get justice, they get compensation because of the crimes he committed. But he did say that, you know, his death also should be a lesson for other African dictators who are torturing, who are beating, who are traumatizing their people. It should be a lesson that one day they will also face justice, or one day they will also be like Hissene Habre.
Fred Mvuni speaking to us from Lagos. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Reid Brody. He's a human rights lawyer and member of the International Commission for Jurists. He was formerly at Human Rights Watch. Well, as we heard from Fred, many people saying that they still have not been compensated for the crimes committed. What options do they have now?
Well, the victims, as we saw, campaigned for 20 years, not just to get compensation, but it's really thanks to the victims that these trials happened. There was one trial in Senegal where Hissene Habre was convicted of crimes against humanity and ordered to pay $125 million to the victims. And the African Union was ordered to establish a trust fund to search for and seize Habre's assets and to solicit voluntary contributions. 5 years later, that trust fund has not been set up. The victims also were able to convict, in a separate trial in Chad, 21 of Habre's henchmen. And in that trial, a Chadian court ordered the Chadian government to pay $125 million. And in 6 years since that judgment, we've seen nothing. So in theory, the victims are millionaires, but they haven't seen a penny. And as you reported, they are in very dire circumstances.
So what pressure can be applied to the likes of the African Union, the Chadian government, and also other judicial authorities to ensure that there is decisive action to pay for these reparations?
Well, it's a question of mobilizing attention and political pressure. And hopefully with the death of Hissene Habre, a new focus will be on this. Last year, Clément, the gravedigger, and I were at the African Union in Addis Ababa during the summit. And during the summit, the chair of the African Union, Mohamed Faki, who was the former foreign minister of Chad, promised publicly that this trust fund would be set up, and it hasn't been. So the question, and the Chadian government has been implored by UN rapporteurs and experts to make good on its own commitment and obligation to the victims. So it's a question really of focusing attention, of mobilizing shame. I mean, these victims are heroes. It's because of them that a dictator was brought to justice and his henchmen. They have done something the International Criminal Court has never done: prosecute and convict a dictator. And not only are they not being rewarded for it, they're being really hung out to dry by the government and by the African Union.
What you're saying is that the world has potentially forgotten about the people of Chad and how they've been suppressed. So, in practical terms, how do you make this issue high on the world agenda?
Well, I think by talking about it, thanks, this Deutsche Welle program is very important. We've been talking, Clement, Suleiman Gengeng, a victim who began the fight for justice 25 years ago, Jacqueline Mudena, the Chadian lawyer who was almost killed by Habre's henchmen in a grenade attack. We've all been using these last few days, Hissene Habre's death, to talk about this, to focus attention on the plight of the victims and their plea for justice.
Aside from the monetary compensation, what else do the victims want to happen in Chad?
Well, the court that convicted Habre's henchmen ordered as well that the former, the most iconic prison of Hissene Habre, this so-called piscine, which actually a former swimming pool that was covered over and became an underground dungeon, that the piscine be made into a museum of the Habre period. The court ordered that a monument be set up for the estimated 40,000 Chadians who were killed during that period. The victims have been speaking out. They're out like every week. The victims go out with pots and pans on the streets of N'Djamena to remind people of what happened and their demands. None of these demands have been met yet, other than bringing Habre to justice, which again is a huge achievement. The first time ever in history that the victims have organized to bring their dictator to justice in a foreign country. Never has that happened before, that the courts of one country, Senegal, have prosecuted and convicted the leader of another country, Chad. And it's because of these victims, because of their organizing.
All right. Reid Brody, thank you very much indeed for speaking to DW News Africa.
You're quite welcome.